the street where America's wealth learned to hide. There was a street in New York where fortunes were not earned but orchestrated, where the grandest mansions in America rose not from honest labor but from information that moved through private dining rooms before it reached the public market, where wealth appeared effortless because the effort, the manipulation, the coordination, the quiet transfer of risk from the initiated to the ignorant, was invisible by design. The street glittered. Behind the doors, men who controlled capital made decisions that would ruin families they would never meet, destroy savings they would never see, and concentrate wealth through mechanisms the law had not yet learned to name. This was not old money preserving itself. This was new money performing as if it were old, building palaces to suggest permanence while operating with the ruthlessness of pirates. The mansions were fortresses of respectability, each one a declaration that its owner belonged to a class that existed above consequence. Inside, over wine and cigars, information became currency. A whispered tip about a railroad merger. Advance warning of a bank's weakness. Coordination on when to buy and when to sell, creating waves that the men inside could ride while everyone else drowned. The street survived for decades, protected by the same mechanisms that made it possible: control of information, control of access, control of the narrative. Then came the collapse that made control irrelevant. The market turned. Credit vanished. The mansions that had seemed eternal became liabilities that could not be maintained. Within months, the street that represented American power was transformed into a liquidation corridor, its interiors auctioned, its owner scattered, its meaning erased. This is the story of the richest street in America, built on advantages that were never admitted and financed by losses that were never acknowledged. A street where wealth learned to hide in plain sight, and where the hiding became more valuable than the wealth itself, until hiding was no longer enough. The final decades of the 19th century created a class of men who understood that information was more valuable than labor. The American economy was consolidating. Railroads were merging. Banks were absorbing competitors. Industrial operations were combining into trusts that controlled entire sectors. Each consolidation created winners and losers, fortunes made and fortunes destroyed, all determined by a simple question: who knew first? The men who positioned themselves to receive information before it became public could trade on certainty while others traded on hope. They could buy before prices rose and sell before they fell. They could move capital with precision while the broader market moved on rumor and panic. This was not illegal, not yet. The laws that would eventually regulate securities and define insider trading did not exist. The market operated according to rules that favored those who made the rules. Stock exchanges were private clubs. Corporate information was shared selectively. The men who sat on multiple boards, who lunched with bankers and dined with railroad presidents, who belonged to the right associations and lived at the right addresses, had access to knowledge that translated directly into wealth. And they understood, intuitively, that this access had to be protected through social structures that appeared natural but were actually engineered. New York's geography became a map of power. Downtown was where money was made. The exchanges, the banks, the brokerage houses where capital moved through systems the public barely understood. Uptown was where money was displayed and protected. The neighborhoods that mattered, the streets where the right families built, functioned as social filters, screening for wealth but also for discretion, for understanding of unwritten rules, for membership in networks that operated through implication rather than documentation. One stretch became the epicenter of this world. A corridor of mansions so concentrated, so expensive, so carefully guarded that the address itself became a form of credential. To own a house, there was to declare that you belonged to the class that controlled American capital. To be invited inside was to be trusted with information that could move markets. To be excluded was to remain among those who absorbed the consequences of decisions made in drawing rooms you would never enter. The street did not announce its purpose. It did not need to. The mansions themselves, their scale, their location, their very existence, were the message. The people inside operated according to rules that did not apply to everyone else. Wealth at this level was not subject to the same forces that constrained ordinary fortunes. Or so it appeared. The appearance was the point. And maintaining the appearance required constant, invisible effort, controlling who entered, controlling what was said, controlling the narrative that explained why some men became impossibly rich while others lost everything in markets that seemed, to them, incomprehensible. The era called itself the Gilded Age, a term that suggested beauty covering something less beautiful. But the term was too gentle. What was being covered was not merely ugliness but a systematic transfer of wealth from those who lacked information to those who possessed it. The mansions were not symptoms of an unjust system. They were the system's headquarters. The men who built on the street shared certain characteristics that were rarely acknowledged but universally understood. They were not, for the most part, heirs to old fortunes. They were builders of new ones, men who had recognized that the consolidation of American industry created opportunities for those positioned to exploit them. They learned that serving on a bankboard while investing in railroads created access to information that could be weaponized. That coordinating with other large investors could move stock prices in predictable directions. That the appearance of confidence could become self-fulfilling if enough capital followed your lead. Take one figure, not unique but representative, who rose through finance in the decades after the Civil War. His origins were respectable but not distinguished. A commercial family, enough education to understand contracts and accounting, enough ambition to see that the real fortunes were being made not in trade but in capital itself. He began in a brokerage house, learning how information moved, who had it first, and how the gap between private knowledge and public awareness created profit. He was disciplined. While others spent early earnings on display, he reinvested. He cultivated relationships with men who sat on boards, who controlled trusts, who made decisions about mergers and acquisitions before those decisions were announced. He learned to listen more than he spoke, to ask questions that revealed what others knew, to position himself as useful, someone who could be trusted with sensitive information because he understood its value and would not waste it through careless disclosure. His breakthrough came through a railroad consolidation. He learned, weeks before the public announcement, that two competing lines would merge. He bought shares at depressed prices, positioned himself to benefit from the surge that followed the announcement, and sold at the peak before the reality of operational challenges brought prices back down. The profit was substantial. But more valuable than the money was the lesson. Information, properly used, was the most reliable form of leverage. He repeated the pattern. Each success brought access to better information, which enabled larger successes, which brought membership in networks where information flowed more freely. He married strategically, a woman whose family connections opened additional doors. He joined the clubs that mattered. He served on boards that gave him insight into multiple industries. And as his fortune grew, he understood that protecting it required more than smart investing. It required controlling the social and physical spaces where information was shared. He built a mansion on the street that was becoming synonymous with financial power. The location was strategic. His neighbors were men like him, financiers who understood that proximity created opportunity, that private dinners could facilitate coordination, that living among peers who shared interests meant information would flow through casual conversation rather than formal channels that might leave records. The mansion was not a home. It was infrastructure, a node in a network that moved capital through mechanisms the broader public did not understand and laws did not yet address. He was dangerous not because he broke rules but because he operated in spaces where rules had not yet been written. And he was unusually competent at the one skill that mattered most, understanding that control of information required control of access, and that maintaining both required appearing as if neither was being controlled at all. The formative lesson came through a panic that should have destroyed them but instead taught them what mattered. The market collapsed in the 1870s with a speed that caught even experienced investors unprepared. Banks failed. Railroads defaulted. Stock prices fell so rapidly that the mechanisms meant to contain panic, trading halts, calls for calm, proved inadequate. Fortunes that had seemed secure evaporated within days. Men who had been wealthy on Friday were ruined by Monday. Suicides followed. Families were displaced. The crash rippled through the economy, destroying jobs, closing factories, creating a depression that would last for years. The financiers on the street survived. Not all of them. Some had been overextended, had believed their own mythology, had failed to maintain the liquidity needed to weather sudden contraction. But most survived. And the reason they survived was simple. They had known the crash was coming. Not the precise timing. No one could predict that. But they had seen the warning signs that ordinary investors missed or misunderstood. They had access to bank balance sheets, to railroad revenues, to the quiet conversations where bankers admitted concern and fellow board members expressed doubt. They had reduced their exposure weeks before the collapse, moving capital into safer positions while publicly maintaining confidence to avoid triggering the very panic they were preparing for. When the crash came, they were positioned not just to survive but to profit, buying assets at distressed prices from investors who had to sell to cover losses. The lesson was not lost on them. The market could turn quickly. Fortunes could be destroyed. But those who controlled information could protect themselves and even benefit from disasters that ruined others. The key was maintaining the networks that provided early warning, the discretion that prevented panic, and the social structures that kept their coordination invisible to those outside the system. The street became more than a residential corridor. It became a fortress designed to protect the mechanisms that had saved them. The mansions were rebuilt or expanded, each renovation an opportunity to create spaces optimized for the kind of private conversations that move capital. Dining rooms large enough for dinners where 20 men could gather without staff overhearing strategic discussions. Libraries with doors that closed and walls thick enough to muffle voices. Studies where documents could be reviewed in privacy. Gardens where 2 men could walk and speak without being observed. The social rules tightened. Not everyone with money could buy on the street. You needed the right sponsors, the right memberships, the right understanding of how things worked. This selectivity was framed as maintaining standards, preserving neighborhood character, ensuring compatibility among neighbors. But the real purpose was control. The street functioned as a filter, admitting only those who could be trusted to understand that what happened in these houses, the conversations, the information shared, the coordination, stayed in these houses. Staff were hired not just for competence but for discretion. A butler who managed a household on the street understood that his primary job was not service but silence. Conversations overheard were to be forgotten immediately. Documents left on desks were never read. Guests' identities and the timing of their visits were information that existed nowhere outside the household. The servants who lasted were those who learned that seeing nothing, hearing nothing, and remembering nothing was more valuable than any skill they might bring to their actual duties. The street had become a machine designed to concentrate and protect information. And the men who lived there had learned that the machine's greatest vulnerability was exposure, that if the public understood how decisions were made, how information moved, how coordination functioned, the system would become unsustainable. And so they built walls, physical walls of stone and iron, social walls of exclusivity and selection, and informational walls of silence and discretion. The panic had taught them what they needed to know. And what they needed was control. The product the street offered was not obvious to outsiders but was perfectly clear to those who needed it. It was not real estate, though the mansions were valuable. It was not society, though the social connections mattered. What the street offered was membership in a network where information moved before it became news, where coordination could happen without documentation, where decisions that would affect markets could be made over dinner without anyone outside the room knowing that the dinner had occurred. The street functioned as an informal exchange, a place where the men who controlled American capital could meet without the scrutiny that would apply to formal gatherings, where strategies could be discussed without creating the paper trail that might later become evidence. This was valuable precisely because it was invisible. The men on the street did not gather to conspire, or at least, they did not call it conspiracy. They gathered as neighbors, as friends, as fellow members of clubs and boards who happened to live near each other and naturally socialized. The conversations were casual. The information shared was presented as general knowledge, the kind of thing anyone might mention in passing. But everyone present understood that general knowledge shared weeks before it became public was actionable intelligence, and that acting on it before others could was the difference between wealth and ruin. The street also offered protection through reputation. To live there was to be presumed respectable, competent, trustworthy. If questions arose about how you had made your fortune, the address provided a partial answer. You belonged to the class of men who succeeded through ability and connections, not through anything that might require investigation. The mansions were character references made of stone, suggesting that their owners operated according to rules that did not need to be explained because everyone who mattered already understood them. For the wives who managed the social machinery, the street offered something equally valuable: the power to determine who belonged. The women on the street controlled access through mechanisms that appeared purely social but functioned as business infrastructure. Who received invitations? Whose daughters were suitable for whose sons? Which families were rising and which were declining? These determinations affected more than social standing. They affected business relationships, board memberships, access to deals. A woman who could exclude a rival's family from the right gatherings could damage her husband's competitor more effectively than any business maneuver. The street also provided something harder to quantify but essential to its function: the appearance of inevitability. The mansion suggested that the men who owned them had always been wealthy, would always be wealthy, that their success was natural rather than constructed. This appearance mattered because it prevented questions. If wealth looked inevitable, people did not ask how it had been accumulated. If power looked permanent, people did not challenge its legitimacy. The street was theatre, carefully staged to make what was actually quite recent, Fortunes built within a generation look as old and solid as the stone used to build the houses. And finally, the street offered plausible deniability. If accused of coordination, the men could point out that they were simply neighbors who occasionally socialized. If questioned about information advantages, they could claim they were merely well-informed, that anyone with their experience would reach similar conclusions. The street allowed them to operate as a network while maintaining the appearance of being individuals who happened to live near each other. The architecture of proximity created the infrastructure of coordination, while appearing to be nothing more than successful men choosing to live in a desirable neighborhood. This was the product. And it worked because everyone who needed it understood what it was without anyone having to explain it. The mansions that lined the street were designed with purposes that went far beyond residential comfort. Step inside one of them, choose any, as they shared certain characteristics despite differences in architectural style, and you entered a space where every room served the dual function of displaying wealth and facilitating the transactions that created it. The entrance hall was calculated grandeur: marble floors, paneled walls, a staircase positioned to be seen immediately, lighting that created the impression of warmth without revealing the mechanisms that produced it. The message was delivered before the guest had removed their coat. You have entered a house that operates at a level most people will never experience. But the real work happened deeper inside, in rooms designed for privacy and acoustic control. The dining room was large enough to seat 24, with doors thick enough to muffle conversation and windows positioned to prevent anyone outside from seeing who was present. The table itself was a platform for the kind of extended meals where business could be discussed between courses, where wine loosened tongues but not among strangers. Everyone present had been vetted, everyone understood the rules. Servants entered and exited through concealed doors, appearing only when needed, vanishing before they could hear anything that mattered. The library was the house's operational center. Leather chairs arranged for conversation. Shelves holding books that demonstrated taste but rarely read. A desk positioned for reviewing documents in lamplight. And most importantly, doors that locked, windows too high for anyone outside to observe, and walls shared with no other room. This was where the most sensitive conversations happened, where documents could be spread out and examined, where 2 or 3 men could discuss information that would move markets if it became public. The furnishings suggested culture, but the architecture facilitated control. The drawing room was for the wives, a space where social machinery was maintained through seemingly casual conversation. Who was gaining in stature? Whose family was stretched financially? Which businesses were facing pressure? The women who managed these spaces understood that their role was not decorative. They were intelligence officers, gathering information through social networks that paralleled and often exceeded their husband's business networks. A wife who learned that a rival's family was quietly selling assets could provide her husband with warning of a competitor's vulnerability. A woman who understood which families were rising could position her daughters to marry into ascendant fortunes before others recognized the opportunity. The staff quarters, by contrast, were minimal and positioned to keep servants separate from family and guests. A household on the street might employ 20 people, but they lived in spaces that occupied perhaps 10% of the house's total area. This was deliberate. Servants were tools, necessary but not integrated into the family's life. Their quarters were reached through back stairs, their movements choreographed to keep them invisible unless needed. The separation was functional. The less staff saw, the less they could accidentally reveal. Security was embedded in design. The street's mansions featured limited points of entry, each controlled by staff trained to assess visitors. Deliveries came through service entrances and back alleys, keeping tradespeople away from the front door where their presence might be noticed. Windows on ground floors were often barred or frosted, preventing casual observation from the street. The houses presented solid facades to the public while maintaining privacy for their occupants, privacy that was valuable not for personal reasons but for business ones. The interiors were updated constantly, not because styles changed but because maintenance of perfection was itself a signal. A house that showed any sign of neglect suggested its owner might be under financial pressure, which could undermine business relationships and social standing. And so the work was continuous. Walls repainted, fabrics replaced, hardware polished, systems upgraded. The cost was enormous, but the cost of not maintaining standards was higher. A reputation damaged by a shabby drawing room could lose business worth more than the entire house. What the street had built was not a residential neighborhood but a physical infrastructure for information control. The mansions were fortresses disguised as homes, designed to facilitate coordination while appearing to be nothing more than where wealthy men happened to live. The street operated according to rules that were never posted but rigorously enforced. Access began at the door, where each household maintained a system for screening visitors. Not through crude interrogation but through practiced observation. The doorman knew which carriages belonged to families who could arrive unannounced and which required advance notice. He recognized the men whose visits were expected and assessed those who were not. A stranger claiming business with the master of the house would be asked to wait while their legitimacy was confirmed, not questioned directly, but assessed through mechanisms that appeared courteous while functioning as security. Once admitted, guests understood that different spaces carried different permissions. The entrance hall and formal drawing room were semi-public. Information shared there had to be assumed capable of traveling beyond the house. The dining room, during formal dinners with multiple guests, was more private but not entirely secure. But the library, the study, the garden walks, these were spaces where real business happened, where the men who controlled capital could speak with the confidence that what was said would not leave the room. The staff's role in maintaining this system was absolute. They were trained to appear deaf to conversations that happened in their presence, to forget immediately anything they accidentally overheard, to treat documents left on desks as invisible. The butler who managed a household on the street understood that his reputation, and thus his ability to secure future employment, depended on his discretion. A single breach, a single instance of information leaving the house through servant gossip, and his career was finished. The other households would learn within days, and no one would hire someone who could not be trusted with silence. Reports from former staff, recorded decades later when the street's power had faded and confidentiality no longer mattered, describe households that operated with intensity that bordered on paranoia. Conversations would stop when servants entered rooms. Documents would be turned face down or slipped into drawers. Men would move to windows or gardens to continue discussions they did not want overheard. The constant vigilance was not about protecting secrets in any traditional sense. These men were not criminals, or at least they did not think of themselves as criminals. They were protecting information that, if disclosed prematurely, would lose its value. Money moved through these houses in ways that would not appear in any formal accounting. A dinner where information was shared that enabled a guest to make profitable trades. How would you value that? The cost was wine and food. The return was wealth that might exceed the house's entire value. A private conversation in a library where two men coordinated their positions in a stock. There was no invoice, no contract, no record. But the coordination might move the stock's price enough to generate profits that made the men's official salaries seem trivial. Contemporary observers noted the street's opacity with frustration. Journalists who covered financial markets understood that decisions were being made that affected public companies, but they could not penetrate the social mechanisms where those decisions were coordinated. Reformers who suspected manipulation could not prove it. There were no documents, no formal agreements, just men who happened to live near each other and occasionally socialized. The street had created a system where coordination could happen through proximity and social connection, leaving no evidence that could be used against them. The machine's elegance was in its deniability. If accused of operating as a cartel, the men could point out that they were simply neighbors. If questioned about information advantages, they could claim their success came from experience and judgment. The street allowed them to function as a coordinated entity while maintaining the legal and social fiction that they were individuals who happened to live in the same area. And for decades, this worked. The wealth compounded. The mansions grew more elaborate. The street's reputation became self-reinforcing. To live there was proof of success, and proof of success attracted opportunity, which generated more success. The system seemed invulnerable because it was built on social mechanisms that were difficult to regulate and information advantages that were hard to document. But every machine has vulnerabilities. And the street's vulnerability was that it had built itself on a foundation that assumed control could be maintained indefinitely. The peak arrived on an evening that seemed, to those present, like countless evenings before it. A private dinner at one of the street's largest mansions, guest list limited to 16. Men who controlled railroads, banks, industrial trusts, and the political connections that protected them all. The invitation had specified no particular occasion, but everyone present understood this was not social. Something significant was being coordinated, and attendance was not optional for those who wanted to remain part of the network. The guests arrived between 7:30, their carriages stopping at the entrance where doormen received them without ceremony. These were men who required no announcement. They moved through the entrance hall into the drawing room where wine was being served, greeting each other with the ease of people who met regularly, whose relationships were built on shared interests that went far beyond friendship. The conversation was careful. Market conditions, political developments, the kind of general discussion that could happen in front of staff without revealing anything specific. Dinner was served at 8 in a dining room lit by chandeliers that created the impression of daylight even after dark. The meal proceeded through courses designed to occupy time without demanding attention. Consommé, fish, sorbet, beef, vegetables prepared with precision, wine selected to complement rather than overwhelm. The real purpose of the meal was not the food but the opportunity it created for conversation that could develop naturally, that could be steered toward specific topics without appearing orchestrated. Between the third and fourth courses, the host made a remark that seemed casual but that everyone present recognized as an opening. He mentioned, as if in passing, that he had heard a particular railroad was facing difficulties. Nothing public yet, but sources suggested problems with revenue, with debt, with operational challenges that had not been disclosed to shareholders. He said this without emphasis, without drama, simply as a piece of information that might interest his guests. The response was immediate but subtle. Questions that probed without seeming urgent. Comments that added additional information. Someone else had heard similar things from different sources. A third guest mentioned that he had reduced his position in the railroad stock, not because of inside knowledge but because the fundamentals seemed questionable. A fourth noted that if conditions worsened, there might be opportunities to acquire assets at favorable prices. Within 15 minutes, a consensus had emerged without anyone stating it explicitly. The railroad was vulnerable, positions should be reduced, and once the problems became public and the stock price collapsed, there would be buying opportunities for those with capital available. No one proposed coordinated action. No one suggested manipulation. But everyone present understood that they had just received information that was not public, had confirmed it through multiple sources, and had reached a shared conclusion about how to respond. The dinner continued through additional courses. The conversation moved to other topics: politics, society gossip, upcoming business. But the transaction had been completed. Information had been shared and confirmed. Coordination had been established without documentation. When the guests departed after midnight, each would return home and instruct their brokers on positions to reduce, capital to preserve, opportunities to prepare for. And when the railroad's problems became public weeks later, when its stock collapsed and shareholders lost fortunes, these men would be positioned to avoid losses and capitalize on the panic. The win, for those at the dinner, was substantial. Losses avoided, profits taken at advantageous times, assets acquired at distressed prices. The loss was carried by investors who lacked access to the information shared that evening, who held positions while the initiated were selling, who were still buying on optimism while the men on the street were preparing to profit from the collapse they knew was coming. One guest, departing, made a comment to his host that others overheard. He said the evening had been perfectly managed, that the quality of information shared was exceptional, that these gatherings were more valuable than any formal business arrangement could be. The host accepted the compliment with a smile that suggested he understood exactly what was being acknowledged. But neither man could have known that this particular evening, this coordination, this sharing of privileged information, this coordination disguised as social gathering, was happening at a moment when the mechanisms they relied on were beginning to fail. The system they had built assumed that control could be maintained, that information could remain private, that the broader market would continue to provide opportunities to exploit. The peak they were experiencing felt stable because it had lasted for decades. But stability built on information advantage only endures while the advantage can be protected. And protection was about to become impossible. The enemy emerged not as a single antagonist, but as a constellation of forces that the street had not anticipated and could not control. The first pressure came from reformers who had been watching the street for years with growing suspicion. They could not prove coordination. There were no documents, no smoking guns, no insider confessions. But they could see the patterns. Men on the street consistently profited from market movements that destroyed ordinary investors. They avoided losses that others absorbed. They acquired assets at prices that suggested they had known when to strike. The reformers lacked evidence but possessed conviction, and they began using the tools available to them. Newspaper editorials questioning how certain men always seem to win, legislative proposals aimed at regulating stock trading and corporate disclosure, public speeches suggesting that wealth at this scale could not be innocent. The second pressure was economic. The market's growth had been driven by speculation that assumed continuous expansion, but expansion was slowing. Railroads had been built to saturation. Industries had consolidated to the point where additional mergers created diminishing returns. The mechanisms that had generated easy wealth were maturing, and profits were becoming harder to extract. The men on the street remained rich, but their fortunes were no longer growing at the rates they had experienced and that their lifestyles required. The mansions consumed capital at a steady rate while the investments that had funded them were producing less. Then came the whispers of scandal. One railroad went bankrupt after its executives, including men from the street, had sold their personal holdings weeks before the collapse became public. Shareholders filed lawsuits alleging insider trading and fraud. The cases moved slowly through courts that were sympathetic to business interests, but the publicity was damaging. Newspapers began connecting names, tracking which men had served on which boards, noting patterns of trading that suggested coordination. The street's opacity, which had been its strength, became evidence of something hidden. Inside the mansions, the mood shifted. The easy confidence of earlier years gave way to caution that bordered on paranoia. Conversations that had once happened in dining rooms moved to gardens or private studies. Information that had been shared relatively freely became more guarded. The men who had operated as a network began to wonder if the network itself was becoming a liability, if coordination that left no paper trail might still be proven through circumstantial evidence, through patterns of trading, through the testimony of servants or associates who could be pressured to reveal what they had witnessed. Staff began to sense instability. Household managers noticed that budgets were being questioned, that expenses that had never been challenged were now being reviewed. Some mansions quietly reduced staff, not dramatically, but enough to signal pressure. Suppliers noticed that payments were being delayed, that accounts that had always been settled promptly were now being stretched. These were small signs, invisible to outsiders, but within the street's ecosystem they were recognized as warnings. Political change accelerated the pressure. Progressive politicians, empowered by public anger over the gap between the street's wealth and the broader population struggles, began pushing for new regulations. Stock exchanges would be subject to oversight. Corporate insiders would face restrictions on trading. Information that had been private would have to be disclosed. The laws were still being debated, their final forms unclear, but the direction was obvious. The mechanisms that had made the street's wealth possible were being targeted for elimination. But the fatal pressure came from the market itself. A combination of factors, overextended credit, overvalued assets, international financial instability, and the exhaustion of speculative opportunities, created conditions where a shock could trigger cascade failures. The men on the street understood risk better than most, but they had become overconfident in their ability to manage it. They believed that their information advantages would allow them to see problems coming and adjust positions accordingly. They believed that coordination could protect them from the consequences of market-wide collapse. They were wrong. And the error would cost them the street itself. The collapse began with a failure at a bank that seemed, at first, manageable. The morning brought news that a mid-sized financial institution had suspended operations, unable to meet demands from depositors who had learned of bad loans on its books. The street's financiers received word before the newspapers did. Their networks ensured that, but this time, the early warning provided no advantage. The problem was not the single bank but what it revealed. Many institutions were overextended, many portfolios were built on optimism rather than fundamentals, and confidence, the foundation of the entire financial system, was more fragile than anyone had admitted. Within hours, panic spread. Other banks faced runs. Stock prices began falling as investors, fearing broader collapse, tried to convert holdings to cash. The men on the street moved quickly to protect themselves, but discovered that everyone else with access to information was doing the same thing. When everyone tried to sell simultaneously, there were no buyers at prices that preserved wealth. Fortunes that existed on paper evaporated in the gap between what assets were supposed to be worth and what anyone would actually pay for them. The street's great vulnerability was exposed: the mansions. Each house cost enormous sums to maintain. Staff salaries, taxes, utilities, repairs, the constant upkeep required to maintain standards. These costs had been manageable when investment income exceeded them. But as portfolios collapsed and credit tightened, the costs became unbearable. The men who owned the mansions discovered they could not liquidate positions without taking catastrophic losses, could not borrow against assets that were falling in value, could not reduce costs without signaling the very weakness that would destroy their remaining business relationships. Panic moved through the street in ways that were invisible from outside. Behind the facades, families held emergency meetings with lawyers and accountants who delivered news that seemed impossible. The wealth that had seemed infinite was actually constrained. The assets that had seemed solid were actually illiquid. The options for preserving fortunes were limited and bad. Selling the mansions themselves became necessary, but the market for such properties had collapsed. Who would buy a house that cost a fortune to maintain in an economic crisis when fortunes were evaporating? Within weeks, the signs became public. The first auction notice appeared. A mansion's contents would be sold to settle debts. Then another. Then a third. The street that had represented American financial power was transforming into a corridor of liquidation, its interiors being dispersed to satisfy creditors, its families displaced, its reputation as a fortress of stability revealed as mythology that had depended on conditions that no longer existed. The staff were dismissed in waves, given severance that was less than promised and often delayed by weeks. Former servants described receiving notices in envelopes marked urgent, being told that household operations would cease immediately, that positions were being eliminated not because of performance but because the households themselves could no longer function. The butler who had maintained silence about private conversations, the housekeeper who had preserved perfection in rooms where information moved, the doorman who had screened access, all were released into a job market that had collapsed along with the fortunes they had served. The press covered the collapse with intensity that mixed outrage and satisfaction. The same newspapers that had once treated the street with deference now published detailed accounts of auction sales, cataloguing the dispersal of furnishings and art that represented fortunes being broken into pieces. Journalists who had been excluded from the street's private world now walked through its mansions during public viewings before auctions, describing interiors that had been designed for privacy being open to anyone who wanted to view them. Reformers used the collapse as evidence for the regulations they had been proposing. They argued that the street's wealth had been built on manipulation, that the information advantages and coordination had created systemic instability, that protecting ordinary investors required dismantling the informal networks where privileged knowledge moved without oversight. The laws that followed the collapse would make many of the street's practices illegal, but by then the street itself was being transformed beyond recognition. The mansions were sold, often for fractions of their construction costs, to buyers who had different purposes. Some were converted to institutional use, clubs or foundations or corporate offices. Others were demolished entirely, replaced by commercial buildings that would generate rental income rather than representing residential wealth. The family scattered. Some rebuilt modest fortunes elsewhere, others disappeared from public view. A few faced legal consequences for practices that were now being prosecuted as fraud. Within 5 years, the street's identity had vanished. The physical corridor remained, but it no longer represented what it had represented. The mansions that survived were occupied by institutions or corporations or subdivided into apartments. The concentration of financial power had dispersed to other locations, other mechanisms, other networks that learned from the street's failure to be less visible, less concentrated, less vulnerable to the kind of collapse that had erased the street's meaning. Today, if you walk the corridor that was once America's richest street, you see commercial buildings and institutional facades. A few of the original mansions survive, repurposed so completely that their origins are difficult to recognize. The majority were demolished decades ago, their sites now occupied by structures that serve the financial district's expansion but bear no memory of the private empires that once stood there. Plaques occasionally mark where particular mansions existed, but they offer no detail about what actually happened inside, about the information that moved through drawing rooms and libraries, about the coordination disguised as social gathering. The family's names survive in some contexts: charitable foundations, business entities, descendants who rebuilt in different industries. But the dynasty that had seemed permanent, the network that had controlled American capital, proved vulnerable to forces its members had believed they could manage. They had built their wealth on information advantage and coordination, but they had not anticipated that those advantages could be eliminated through regulation or that coordination could become liability rather than strength when everyone coordinated in the same direction at the same time. What was protected, ultimately, was the system itself. Individual fortunes were destroyed, but capital persisted. It simply moved to different hands, different addresses, different mechanisms. What was sacrificed were the people, the families displaced, the staff left unemployed, the small investors whose savings evaporated in crashes that the street's residents had helped create and had tried to profit from. The street had risen as a fortress of control. It fell when control became impossible to maintain. Stand where the street used to concentrate American financial power, and you will find almost nothing that remembers what happened there. The buildings are different now: office towers, institutional headquarters, commercial properties that generate revenue rather than representing residential wealth. The few surviving mansions from the era have been so completely converted that their origins are nearly invisible. Facades preserved by landmark regulations while interiors have been gutted and rebuilt for modern use. The street looks like business district real estate because that is what it is now. The meaning it once carried, the suggestion of permanence, the appearance of inevitable wealth, the promise of control, has been erased. This erasure was not accidental. The collapse made the street a symbol of something embarrassing, Wealth built on advantages that were eventually called corruption, fortunes created through mechanisms that were redefined as fraud, a system that had operated openly because the law had not yet caught up with it. The families who survived the collapse had no interest in preserving memories of how their wealth had been made. The institutions that replaced the mansions had no investment in the street's history. The city itself moved on, allowing the physical remnants to be demolished or converted without resistance because there was no constituency for preservation. What survived was not the place but the lesson, though it is a lesson that each generation seems to learn incompletely. The street demonstrated that information can be weaponized, that coordination disguised as social connection can move markets, that the appearance of inevitability can be engineered through architecture and social mechanisms. But it also demonstrated that these advantages are conditional, that they depend on circumstances that can change, that control is never as absolute as it appears. The question that hangs over the empty space where the street's meaning used to be is this: if a street is built on privileged knowledge rather than productive work, is what it creates actually wealth, or is it extraction disguised as success? The men who lived there would have rejected the question, would have argued that they were simply better informed, more intelligent, more willing to take risks than those who lost money while they gained it. But the collapse revealed what they had worked so hard to hide, that their wealth depended not on superior ability but on superior access, and that when access was democratized through regulation and when coordination became legally risky, the fortunes proved vulnerable. When collapse came, who lost a home and who simply changed addresses? The answer is a division that tells you everything about how the system actually worked. The families who lived on the street lost mansions but not, in most cases, their fundamental financial security. They moved to smaller houses, to different neighborhoods, to lives that were comfortable even if not spectacular. They adjusted. The people who lost homes in any meaningful sense were those whose savings evaporated in market crashes that the street's residents had helped engineer, who lost jobs when businesses failed, who absorbed the consequences of financial instability they had no role in creating. And if the palaces are gone, where did the power go? This is perhaps the most important question. Power did not vanish when the street did. It simply moved to new mechanisms, new locations, new systems that learned from the street's failure to be less visible. The concentration of financial power persists, operating through institutions and networks that are harder to identify with single addresses, harder to target with regulation, harder to hold accountable when failures occur. The street's collapse taught those who control capital not that coordination and information advantage are wrong, but that they should not be so obviously concentrated, so visibly displayed, so easy to identify and regulate. The final irony is that the street's greatest legacy may be the systems designed to prevent anyone from building another street like it. Securities regulations, insider trading laws, disclosure requirements, oversight mechanisms that make the kind of coordination that happened in those mansions technically illegal. But these regulations exist because the street existed first, because what happened there was so egregious that political will formed to stop it. The street destroyed itself through success that became too visible, wealth that became too concentrated, coordination that became too obvious. Walk the corridor now and you see nothing that acknowledges this history. The city has covered the past with present, has replaced private wealth with commercial function, has erased the physical evidence of a system that operated for decades before collapsing under the weight of its own advantages. This erasure is convenient for everyone, for the families whose fortunes survived in attenuated form, for the institutions that replaced the mansions, for a financial system that prefers not to be reminded of how recently its current regulations were written and why they were necessary. The street that concentrated America's wealth learned to hide has been hidden itself, not through conspiracy but through the ordinary process of cities rebuilding, of physical structures being replaced when they no longer serve useful purposes, of memory fading when no one has interest in preserving it. What stands there now has no memory of what came before. And that absence of memory is itself a kind of victory for the forces that prefer not to be remembered. The street rose as a fortress. It fell as a caution. And it persists as an erasure, a space where extraordinary wealth once concentrated but left almost no trace of how that concentration functioned or why it collapsed or what it cost.